Hello, everyone. I'm Stanley Heller, Administrator of Promoting Enduring Peace, a peace and environmental organization that was founded in 1952 in Connecticut, USA. Thank you for attending our Shafer Lecture. I'm going to screen share again and thank the co-sponsoring organizations for this event. Climate Healers, United Poultry Concerns, Vine Sanctuary, Peace Advocacy Network, Plant the Land, Vegan Street, and the Black Veg Fest. As we meet, we must acknowledge that there's a rally in Hartford and in many other cities, protest rallies about the acquittal of the vigilante Rittenhouse. The idea that anyone, including teenagers, can arm themselves with automatic weapons to intimidate or kill protesters is repulsive and, of course, must be opposed. Let me explain the proceedings. In a few moments, I'll introduce our president for a brief welcome, and then I'll introduce our speaker, Christopher Sebastian, and he'll make his address. Christopher wanted this to be a meeting rather than a webinar, so he could glance down at times and see your faces and your reactions. We'll keep everyone on mute during the talk, but the chat will be open. If you make a comment in the chat, please keep it relevant to Christopher's remarks. We don't want to get into side arguments in the chat. It goes without saying, if there are trolls or racists using the chat or through their profiles to spread hate, they'll be excluded from the meeting. After Christopher Sebastian's talk, I'll make a few remarks about promoting enduring peace, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Questions will be put in the chat where people would be able to raise hands, and Christopher will call on people and will unmute them for the question. Please keep any question or comment to no more than 30 seconds. I'd now like to introduce a longtime activist and writer, the president of Promoting Enduring Peace, James Van Pelt.
Thank you, Stan. Can you see me?
Yes.
Oh, there I am. Okay, great. I just wanted to say that this kind of an event is not only something that we do as part of our regular program. This is an annual lecture, but it's also our opportunity to define for ourselves what's going on at this very moment and where it's headed. And I think our motto will summarize that, which is peace on earth, peace with earth. The idea being that we can't achieve international peace if our environment is being shredded, and we can't protect our environment if we're engaged in war. So that interaction defines us and lets you know what our main program is all about, which is the Gandhi Peace Award. I'm sure that Stan will be talking to that a little bit later. For now, I just want to say that PEP is an organization that does the kinds of things that a local peace organization does. Participate in demonstrations and publish statements and so on. But beyond that, we're unusual in that we have a global long-term view of reality. And in that regard, we foresaw what's happening now, and we're continuing to foresee the next stage, which is what's called the convergence. And that's where problems that seem to be separate and in their own little silos influence each other and combine into a truly dangerous situation. So that's kind of the next step. The news tends to be bad, and we have to do something about it. We anticipate a polarization between the forces that are destroying the earth and shredding the peace, and the forces that are small now, but that are in touch with reality and that will join together with many, many other organizations and millions of people to move forward and confront the evil. Billions of years ago, this planet shifted in a major way. It transformed its atmosphere from methane, natural gas, to oxygen. We are now in that same kind of transition, the very climate that we exist in. So there's almost no limit to what is needed to oppose the forces that are blocking us from making the progress we need to make. I'm very happy just to have Christopher because his view is global. And with that, let me turn it back over to you, Stan.
Thank you very much for those thoughts, James. It is now my pleasure to introduce Christopher Sebastian. Christopher Sebastian is a technical writer, a journalist, and a researcher who writes about the intersections of food, politics, pop culture, and media. He lives in New York City and Prague. He lectures on speciesism at Columbia University and is a board member of Peace Advocacy Network. He contributed to the Edinburgh Companion of Literary Studies and wrote the piece, "The Good It Promises, the Harm It Does, Critical Essays on Effective Altruism," edited by Carol J. Adams. He's on the advisory board for Encompass, an organization that addresses racial equity in the animal rights movement. He has written for the Prague Morning, Expats CZ, and Euro News. The title for Christopher's speech is "The Revolution Will Be Plant-Based." And now, Christopher Sebastian.
Thank you so much, Stanley. Thanks to James and everyone who is part of promoting Enduring Peace for having me here. I'm super nervous, which is par for the course for me. I'm always nervous before I do a presentation like this, but I'm really excited to give it, and I'm really honored that I get to give it to this group of people and that I was asked to be a part of the Shafer Lecture this year. So just as a brief introduction before I start showing my PowerPoint, and before I even get to an introduction, let me just talk about some minor housekeeping. Definitely, if you have anything to contribute to the conversation, you're free to put it in the chat now before the Q&A is open. I'm very happy to get feedback from people in real time. If there are any technical difficulties, I want to hear from people, and I'm sure that the organizers want to hear from people too. Make sure that if there are any accessibility issues, we can get those squared away to make sure that all of the participants are taken care of. But yeah, I also like to hear from people, and I like to see people engaging with me, with one another, because I feel like it's more collaborative that way rather than just me talking at you for 30 or 40 minutes. And we will go for about 30 or 40 minutes. I try to keep it to 30, but sometimes I'm long-winded and I fail at that. So with that said, other housekeeping that I wanted to address, there may be some just a content warning, there may be some images or language that will be included in the presentation that may be disturbing or confronting for some people. Just fair warning that may happen. Racially insensitive language, may be used. And confronting things may come up for certain people. And I just want you to be aware of that, be aware of what it is that we're going to be talking about. So now I can get into a bit of an introduction about the presentation. The revolution will be plant-based. What does that mean? I'm vegan. in case you haven't figured that out by now. It is a really big part of my life. It is one of many overlapping and intersecting identities that I have. And it is a really important part of my identity. Part of what we're going to be looking at today is like a lot of the curriculum that I have included in the class that I teach or was teaching at Columbia since I think 2016. And it is a class called Power, Oppression, and Privilege, POP for short. And it's a graduate course in the Department of Social Work. And like, I am so honored that like every year I would get to have these meaningful conversations with students who are very strongly aware of their social location in terms of race, in terms of like, gender, like gender identity, sexuality, class, and like an economic standing, and like, and like the real dangers of capitalism and the realities of exploitation and the minoritization of certain populations of people. And so all of these people who are super, like, super aware usually have this one area where they are completely gobsmacked when we like have conversations, and that is around other animals. And as soon as you start to talk about other animals, you can almost see people shutting down. And it's this realization that the exclusion of other animals from our conversations about social justice and indeed promoting and enduring peace is intentional. It's like, it may not be completely conscious at all times, but it is intentional. And like what I want other students to realize is that we can't actually have a revolution that meaningfully excludes entire groups of or communities of persons because of their species identity or because of their species membership. Every time we start to like have conversations collectively in the in the general public around animals, animal justice, animal liberation, a lot of the ways that we talk end up making us sound like absolute bigots, and that's because of speciesism. And so like veganism, the way that I practice it or the way that I talk about it is a response to that bigotry, a response to that discrimination. It is one of the practices of animal liberation that we need to collectively implement as best we are able. But that's not the way that it's usually perceived. And we'll go over why that is. So we're going to start with we're going to take the Wayback Machine, we're going to get in our time machine and go in the past, and we're going to talk about some of the origins or some of the points of origin that that have been identified by multiple scholars about where the origination of this bigotry has occurred at different points in human history. We'll talk about the ways that it impacts race and gender and social class throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. And then we're going to finish up in the 21st century and talk about how it manifests in our conversations today in the political discourse. And although most of the work that I do and the way that I talk about speciesism is centered in a US American identity or context, it's global. And I try to throw in a couple of examples here or there, but it's only a 30-minute lecture. You're not taking a full 6-week class, regrettably at this time, or maybe thankfully, depending on how you're looking at this. So we're just going to go over as much as we can and just hit some of the highlights. So now I'm going to share my screen and get the presentation started. Here we go. Take it from the top, from the beginning. I can see it on my phone screen and I can see it on my laptop. I'm using my phone for the video portion because my laptop is old and feeble, and it can't have video functions for me. So yeah, the revolution will be plant-based, and like I said, we're going to start in the past. And I saw a couple of names that were in the participant list of friends of mine. So this might be old hat for you. You may have seen some of these slides before. If you have, don't say anything, just act surprised and be like, oh my God, I've never, this is brand new information for me. and just like, and help hype me up a little bit. But yeah, like we're going to start way back in the day. And one of the like touch points that like I had identified insofar as this binary between humans and other animals occurred around the Enlightenment. And like, you know, we had a lot of really great thinkers, a lot of great philosophers. So philosophers, oh, sorry, again, I told you that I'm nervous. Who came up during the Enlightenment and who had amazing things to say. Not to discount any of them, not to discredit any of them, but when we look at some of their ideas, this is John Locke right here. Like, you know, you start to see where, like, you know, where this binary has, like, you know, has kind of like started to creep in or started to be established in more discrete ways. If you're familiar with John Locke, then this quote is probably familiar to you. Like, John Locke talks about like natural rights that humans have. And these natural rights are derived from natural laws who are conferred to us by God himself. And this particular quote I think is really interesting because he says, all mankind being all equal and independent, to no one, excuse me, all mankind being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And like, and this is important because if anybody knows what was kind of going on at around the same time that, like, you know, that these words were being spoken, oh, like we already have someone who's putting it in the chat. See, this is exactly why, like I like having the chat available. We're talking about white men because there were certain groups of people who were not included in all this mankind being equal. They were actually not considered equal at all. They were considered property. Black people were objectified. And so, like, if you're not considered human, if you're not considered part of mankind, you're meaningfully being animalized. And so you've got this sort of like spectrum, or this where there's two binaries on either end. You've got human on one end and animal on the other end, which is really absurd because when you actually think about it scientifically and biologically, humans are ourselves animals. But we kind of, around this time, had started setting up these constructs, these social constructs, in addition to, or like, you know, apart from these biological constructs that created human as a political identity and not just like a species classification. And if you've got human as a political identity, what else have you got? As like, you know, as the opposite to human in this binary or along the spectrum is the animal. As a, like, you know, as a political identity as well. And Black people, i.e. people who look like me, if we're not human, then we're being animalized on the spectrum. And so we were, and still meaningfully are, denied, like, you know, our lives, our health, our liberty, and our possessions. And so this is the political reality that we're living in. And what I find really interesting is that when I have these conversations, often with people, like people of all races and colors, like, you know, there's this resistance to that type of dialogue. There's this resistance to it because the animalization of Black and brown people makes us uncomfortable, and rightfully so, because it's insulting to be considered an animal. It's wrong to be an animal. It's bad to be an animal. But somewhere along the way, we collectively decided that, like, human, or the human as it was constructed by white people during this time, was the preferable identity. It was aspirational, even though it was an identity that was never meant to include us. And so instead of seeking solidarity with other animals who were also being persecuted in this collective system, we actually just made a decision, like consciously or not, to also continue to persecute other animals in the system. And so, yeah, like these are some of the origins of it. And of course, John Locke wasn't alone. This is Descartes, who maintained that animals can't reason and don't feel pain. Animals are living organic creatures, but they're automata, like mechanical robots. Descartes held that only humans are conscious, have minds and souls, can learn and have language, and therefore only humans are deserving of compassion. So you see a lot of this language, like, you know, starting to like creep up around this time, from different places and from different people and from different intellectual communities. And so it wasn't just like confined to one place, but as we like create these identities, these conflicting identities, like, of course, it has consequences for Black and brown people. And There are others as well. Like this, what Descartes is talking about is polygenesis. Polygenesis is a theory of human origins, which posits that the human races are of different origins. This view is opposite to the idea of monogenism, which posits a single origin of humanity. Polygenesis amounted to a justification for Europeans believing themselves essentially different from the rest of the species. So if race, like if different races were actually different species, this like further justifies that Black and brown people are different kinds of animals. We weren't all the same. And it like as it says here, like polygenesis was a justification for Europeans themselves, believing themselves essentially different from everyone else and superior too. And so in that way, again, we see this further animalization that is that is occurring. And so when sometimes even when I'm talking to other vegans, this is actually a really interesting thing to observe, because they often think, well, what does race or social class have to do with like veganism? It's just about animals, right? Well, like it has a lot to do with depending on who is considered a person and who is considered an animal. These things you can't help but observing that that they're intertwined. And there are several theorists who vet into this. You've got Voltaire, George Forster, Christoph Meiners, you've got Anders Retzius. And as I said before, it has consequences for us even now today. This is an article from 2015. Of course, there are several dozens of articles that I could have chosen from that are just like it. And it says San Francisco cop said it was legal to murder a Black man because he was an animal. So unconsciously, we are still creating this this dichotomy between who is considered human and who is deserving of objectification and in many cases murder based on who is perceived to be an animal. And there are other touch points as well. 19th and 20th century literature is just absolutely littered with animalizing language or language that creates this dichotomy or reinforces it in some way. This is an article from the LA Times by Benjamin Rees talking about why do we make children sleep alone? And the quote says, ensuring privacy at night was not just a health concern, it was also a matter of defining proper whiteness or Europeanness. We're saying the quiet part out loud, right? While reformers endorsed solitary sleep as healthful and moral, they noted that savages slept collectively, and this practice was somehow to blame for underdevelopment of the non-Western world. Now, as we go on in that quote, it gets really interesting. According to the physician William Whitty Hall, author of a popular 19th century sleep hygiene book, individuals in co-sleeping societies were like, and I quote, wolves, hogs, and vermin who huddle together. Whereas in the civilized West, each child as it grows up has a separate apartment. Where social sleeping persisted among white people, it was usually associated with poverty and considered a social ill, as in Jacob Riis's 1890, How the Other Half Lives. So I'm just gonna read the first part of that quote again. Individuals in co-sleeping societies were like wolves, hogs, and vermin who huddle together. And there's this unconscious coupling of poor people, even if they're white supremacy is a hell of a drug. It hurts white people as well as Black and brown people. People who were in co-sleeping societies were like these animals, and not just any animals, but these specifically targeted animals as undesirable. Wolves, hogs, and vermin. And so there again is this unconscious animalization and this reinforcing of the idea that anyone who is not part of this white, often male, cisgender, heterosexual upper class who is also landowning and able-bodied, you are part of this permanent underclass that is relegated to that status of an animal and worth very little more than what an animal would be worth in our society. And of course, like I said, there are global consequences for this as well. In Japan, for example, up until the late 1800s, Japan largely existed as a vegetarian society. And it wasn't until Westerners or Europeans actually started coming to started expanding into other places, that they started eating more meat. They were vegetarian societies because the primary or the main religions in Japan were Shinto and Buddhism, which largely had prohibitions against the consumption of meat. But then what happens? You see Europeans showing up and like in an attempt to mimic the wealth of European societies. You see like, the relationship with other animals changing in a drastic and meaningful and very rapid way. And this is from the book Meat Hook by author Marta Zaraska. It happened again. The American occupation after the Second World War gave another powerful boost to the Japanese hunger for meat. The Japanese observed the war victors stuffing themselves with hamburger steaks and bacon. And it persists now too, like between 1970 and 2005, the total amount of beef consumed within the city of Tokyo alone increased by about 160% and 90% for pork. So like, yeah, like these European attitudes toward animals, and especially the consumption of other animals starts to have global consequences for everyone. And it changes, it has changed our relationship with other animals, like just like so much. And I could give you like dozens of examples from all kinds of countries, African countries, South American countries, even here in North America. Like, the way that you see like people's relationships with other animals being changed in places like Mexico. But again, like I don't have time to get into like, Brazil and what's happening there, particularly with like, the devastation of the rainforest for livestock farming. And like, and again, like, these animals like weren't even indigenous to these countries. And now today you have conversations with people about like, oh, this is an innate part of my culture. And like, and like the exploitation of and violence toward other animals is actually something that I'm very proud of, without understanding like, our like global history for maybe 500 years ago. But we'll move on now. I just wanted to talk very briefly about animal experimentation too, and like, how it relates to race and class. This is a quote from the book Medical Apartheid. It says, "The future of the Negro lies more in the research laboratory than in the schools. When diseased, he should be registered and forced to take treatment before he offers his diseased mind and body on the altar of academic and professional education. It was cheaper to use niggers than cats because they were everywhere and cheap experimental animals." And that's a quote from neurosurgeon Harry Bailey in the 1960s. And thank you, Roger, the ICI, Smoking Beagles. Like, this is important because when you read the second part of that quote, which is incredibly like traumatic and emotionally triggering to read, it was cheaper to use Black people than cats because we were everywhere and we were considered cheap experimental animals. Again, saying the quiet part out loud. We are animals ourselves within the system. And so it seems really weird to me that we would choose to like, to aspire to be more like our oppressors, if we'll get into that more later on in the presentation, rather than choosing solidarity with other animals. And I also wanted to point out that like so often when I talk about these things, people say, oh, you're comparing like, you're comparing Black people to animals, and that like, and that invalidates like, this discussion because it makes me deeply uncomfortable. No, I'm actually just observing that the comparison is already there, and it was made 100 years before you and I were even born. And it's an oppressive, it's an oppressive construction for everyone involved, and it is rooted in white supremacy. And so how are we going to fight for Black liberation and try to separate it from animal liberation? We create this binary where these things are in opposition to one another, where like Black liberation has to come like at the expense of or instead of animal liberation, or vice versa. When in reality, like, when both of us are oppressed communities who are experiencing like the residual, the residual harms of white supremacy throughout like Western civilization for hundreds of years. So I'm going to move on from that. And I just wanted to like add another quote also from the book Medical Apartheid, because as late as 1995, in case the 1960s was not recent enough for us, radiation scientist Clarence Lushbaugh explained that he and his partner Eugene Segner chose slum patients as radiation subjects because these persons don't have any money and they're Black and they're poorly washed. And again, it says the quiet part out loud. Not only are we cheap experimental animals, but it like when you have like people who are part of the medical establishment specifically pointing out that it is because of lack of material wealth, because of race and our racial clarification, and because of like our poorly washed unwashed appearance, or the the lack of what people would call the trappings of civilization or participation in civilized society. This is part of what makes someone an animal. These are all of the markers or characteristics that would make someone an animal. And it has so much to do with material wealth, with capitalism, and being non-white. And and this is these are all of the things that collectively make the Black struggle for myself so remarkably consistent with the struggle for animal liberation and necessary to actually achieve together, and meaningfully makes them not opposite from one another. And since we are in the 20th century, like I said, I'm sailing through this really quick because I wanted to move as quickly as possible and try to keep it at 30 minutes. I just wanted to observe some of the other ways in which race and social class and and white supremacy interact with one another. This is an image of Edward Bernays, and a lot of people, I love telling kids this in the classroom, a lot of people don't understand Edward Bernays and the importance of his work as the father of modern propaganda, or as he renamed it, public relations, which is itself an act of propaganda. Bernays is actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud, or he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud. He wrote the book on propaganda. But the reason why I think that it's so compelling to bring him up in the classroom, especially when having conversations about speciesism, is because, in particular in the United States, we have this relationship with one food, and that food is bacon. We have this almost cult-like worship around bacon. And if you ask the average person, they'll tell you that they absolutely just love bacon. It's just something they love. And it's divorced from any sort of critical analysis of why you may love that particular food. And a lot of it goes back to Edward Bernays, who during the 1920s was approached by the Beechnut Packing Company because they wanted to sell more pork. And Bernays had written to thousands, I think up to 5,000 doctors around the country, which was no easy task in the 1920s, because it's not like he could send them an email. And he asked them if a heavier breakfast would be better for the American public than a simple breakfast, which doctors largely at the time agreed that it would be. And so he had launched a campaign of selling bacon and eggs to the public. And that was the first wave of of making bacon a staple food among people in the United States and broadly around the world after that, because American imperialism doesn't happen in isolation, does it? And that's just one of several waves of bacon mania that had oh, thank you so much, Roger, for actually putting that that recommendation in there. Please, definitely, like I said, check the chat. There are going to be awesome recommendations for books, articles, or pieces from other people in there, where you can do all of the research on this yourself. Bacon also holds such a significant place in the American consciousness because of its because of it being a very specific food that fuels white supremacy, in that Jewish people have prohibitions against eating pork, and Muslim people have prohibitions against eating pork. And we'll talk about that a little bit too, in how that manifests in the 21st century. But this specific use of that that particular food is it's fascinating to observe how it just skyrocketed in consumption, all because of the levers that have been put in place by the machine of capitalism, and by specific people in the service again of white supremacist institutions over and over again. So no, I can't accept that you just quote love bacon independently of any of the other social, cultural, or political and economic factors that have influenced that decision that you need to love this particular food. Nothing occurs in a bubble. And this is animals are deployed in various ways within our culture, and the objectification and exploitation of them, it just manifests in so many ways that we're very, very unconscious of, and we really, really need to investigate in order to better unpack our relationships with other animals. And this is from AmericanTable.org. Believe it or not, bacon's association with the American breakfast is barely a century old. Before this, the majority of Americans ate more modest, often meatless breakfasts that might include fruit, a grain porridge, or a roll, and usually a cup of coffee, which I would like to point out is generally a vegan breakfast. And so we treat the non-consumption or the absence of animal products from our diet as something that is weird and foreign, and that that is just completely unimaginable. But that's a part of like, just the bigoted imagination that we have, or the mindset that we have, that can't conceive of a world without animal exploitation, when in reality, it's actually like, it was quite common up until very recently. We have very, very short cultural memories. And we've got a lot of deprogramming to do. And we see it, and like we see animal consumption, like, talking about Edward Bernays and just piggybacking off of that, all up in our advertising all of the time, all throughout the 20th century and in the 21st century. There's absolutely no reason why we would be consuming, or why we should be consuming, like, food from this person, Colonel Sanders, you can see here, who's dressed in the costume of like a 19th century plantation owner. And like, and it seems so weird to me that we never interrogate, like, the fact that like this is like, this is the iconography that we're given around, like, this particular food product, and we're not disturbed by that. We're not disturbed by the fact that, like, that this is happening. We're not like, we don't observe the way that like race is so deeply tied up in, and like, and made again, like, present in our food choices and our food consumption. And we're not taught to question it, which is very unfortunate. And like, as we get into the 21st century now, like, I just wanted to share, and a lot of this, there's like a political analysis that I had written for my thesis called like White Meat. And so a few of these examples are going to come from there. And so this is a video actually of Sarah Palin from the All-American New Year's Eve a few years ago, when Fox News was actually just talking to her. And so it's about 1.5 minutes long, and I'm going to play it. And I think that it's actually very revealing. So I'm going to mute myself and play the audio from the computer. Give me one moment. And so what you're seeing here is like, is the use of meat as a dog whistle to like, to who is considered to be a quote true American. There was no reason for her to actually talk about meat eating right now. Like, she was talking about her New Year's resolution. She wasn't confronted with like a group of rabid vegans or anything. There wasn't any reason for meat to come up in the conversation except to be used in that context. And so what you're seeing is the marriage of meat with a true American quote identity. And so like, and who isn't eating meat is not considered like truly American. So she starts with that dog whistle, and then she progresses all the way up to American exceptionalism. And so you see the instrumentalization of meat in this way, and the exploitation of and the consumption of animals in the physical sense and in the metaphorical sense in order to reinforce these white supremacist institutions and white supremacist ideologies. Are there any non-rabid vegans? Actually, I don't know. I am so aggressively vegan, and I am so aggressively Black, and I am so aggressively gay that I think that that's the only way to characterize myself is like rabid in these senses. So but there are other examples as well. That one was
joining us now.
I think, yikes, I'm so sorry about that. That was from, I think, like 2014, 2015 or something like that. But just a year and a half ago, like during the CPAC, the Conservative Political Action conference. Yeah, it's in the image, it's from 2019. What you're seeing, like animalizing is a rabbit is an animalizing term, but like I don't have a problem with that myself, because like I don't have a problem with animals. Deconstructing language and and the use of it in that way is kind of important. But this is an image of Sebastian Gorka, and he's talking at CPAC, and he's talking about like the quote Green New Deal. And he's saying what they want to do. And I quote him here: they want to take your pickup truck, they want to rebuild your home, they want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamt about but never achieved. You're on the front lines of the war against communism coming back to America under the guise of democratic socialism. And so you're seeing here, like there's a mysterious they. He doesn't actually name who they are. But they're absent from this. It doesn't matter who they are. It's just about the fear mongering. and the marriage of very specific things to communism. And so again, you're seeing this setup of like a very specific type of white nationalist identity that's being built here, and he's building it around having a pickup truck. Having a very specific type of home that I guess he doesn't want to be rebuilt, although we have terrible problems with infrastructure in the United States. And most specifically, he closes with, they want to take away your hamburgers. Meat as something that is symbolic of your freedom as an American citizen is something that is integral to the racist imagination and to the white national identity. And he's using that fear of it being taken away from people here in a very meaningful way. He's also completely wrong. It is ahistorical to say that like this is what Stalin dreamt of, because contrary to what he thinks, Stalin actually sent emissaries to the United States to study food production, and what they did when they had gone back home was to implement the production of, guess what, hamburger patties. So again, like it is this like bastardization of actual history in order to like, to fearmonger among people, something that like we consider especially in the United States, to be such an integral part of our identity that we can't imagine life without it. And that thing is hamburgers, just like it was with Sarah Palin. You see meat being symbolically consumed in this way. And he's not the only one. During that very same CPAC event, you had Jerry Falwell Jr. saying, I have 100 cows, and you just let Alexandria Cortez show up and try to take my cows away, implying violence against a woman of color for, I don't know, doing something that he completely dreamt up in his head. Donald Trump Jr. making jokes about how he loves cows and they're delicious. Mark Meadows saying with this Green New Deal, they're trying to get rid of all the cows. And Ted Cruz saying, I hope to see PETA supporting the Republican Party now that the Democrats want to kill all the cows, which definitely underscores the fact that Ted Cruz doesn't understand how hamburgers actually get made anyway. But again, everyone in one form or another at this conference was hyper-focused on meat, because this is one of the things that is so fundamental to being white, and in many ways being what we consider to be human in Western society. And so we've coupled this with with this part of our identity in a way that can't be divorced. And you see it playing out actually in political circles, in political races, all around the country. This is actually from 2020. And again, this might be familiar to some people. This is the Senate race that some of you may remember if you're coming to us from the United States here, between John Ossoff, who is the then 37-year-old Senate candidate, the Democratic Senate candidate, against Senator David Perdue in Georgia. And Ossoff, of course, being like I said, 37 years old, Democratic candidate and Jewish. He launched his campaign by actually going to Slutty Vegan, which is a restaurant in Atlanta. And it's a obviously vegan restaurant. It's literally in the name, and it's owned by a Black woman. And so what's he symbolizing by going here? You can see from the tweet on the left, he's showing up to Slutty Vegan in support of this business. And this is how he kicked off his campaign that first weekend. What is he signifying? Support for local businesses, support for the Black community, and he's also underscoring his understanding of the climate crisis, because one of the things that we need to focus on in order to help to mitigate the worst effects of climate change is food consumption, in particular livestock, which is a huge and under-discussed contributor to climate change. And so these are these are some of the things that he's signifying. So it's the absence of the consumption of animals that is being utilized or instrumentalized in this campaign. And just a few hours later, in the tweet on the right from Team Perdue, you can see that he's saying Ossoff can have the plant burger, we'll take the all-star special, pick your side, Georgia. Which, by the way, Georgia actually did, because Ossoff won that race. Now, whether or not it's because he went to a vegan restaurant, we're not going to say that that it's specifically for that reason. But but you can see playing out in real time between these two tweets, the use of animals or the instrumentalizing of animals in this way, in the objectification of them. Because in the image that, Purdue actually has, you've got this traditional image of him sitting in the Waffle House with his arms swung around his wife. Very traditional values are what he's signifying here. But literally, he foregrounds the consumption of animals. And he's shunning the absence of animals, or the not eating of animals. And it's a very specific choice of animal foods too, because once again, bacon becomes such a motif that you see being utilized over and over again, especially when people are dog whistling white supremacist ideas. These things are always, they're constantly operating in the background, although they're invisible to us because we don't realize how deeply entrenched the consumption of, objectification of, and exploitation of animals is in our everyday culture. And you see the industries themselves actually, they get in on the act too, and they participate in this as well. This is from a quote from Beef Magazine, and they're doing the fear mongering too. It's like an almost religious call and response. The fight for the center of the dinner plate is on. If tofu, beans, and lentils become the #1 recommendation as the plant-based protein substitutes to beef, then we've not only failed our own industry, but we've failed the children, military, hospital patients, and nursing home residents who will eat according to the new dietary guidelines for America. And so again, you see so many familiar tropes, think of the children. Oh my God, we don't want to fail the children. Fealty to the military, military worship, support our troops. Hospital patients, veterans, nursing homes, up will become down, black will become white, the sky is going to fall, and the bricks will come out of the ceiling. These are the things that are going to happen if people eat tofu and beans and lentils. Oh my God, no. It has to be beef. This is a fundamental attack on our identity as American people, as good people. It's an attack on our freedom. And you also see this with the American Beef Battalion. And yes, there's actually an American Beef Battalion. This is a website that you can go to. You can find it online, and this is their homepage. And you can see the purpose. It's in very small letters, so I actually wrote it again. Purpose is written across the bottom. Organize and sponsor steak feeds, entertainment, programs, meetings, and projects with service members and their families. Encourage and assist them in any reasonable manner. Foster among the people of the United States an appreciation, respect, and honor for our military service members whose sacrifices have and will continue to make our freedoms possible. We're literally wrapping beef up in the American flag. And their last line literally says, and will continue to make our freedoms possible. Beef is symbolic of freedom in these United States. And indeed, again, around the world, because as I mentioned earlier, American imperialism is not confined to America. It never takes a day off, and it very rarely sleeps. And so this is the violence that we are that we're actually projecting to everyone else. And it literally starts with violence against other animals and turning actual meaningful persons, and animals are persons in every way. Personhood is literally conferred to animals in a variety of ways, and we recognize it on an individual level, if not a systemic level. And we turn these persons into objects by treating them as exploitable resources, and then we make those exploitable resources symbolic of our own freedom. And so this is these are the things that that are representative of my veganism and what it means to me. I actually had one more slide. Actually, you know what? Forget it. I'm gonna see if I can find it right now. No, I can't. I didn't. I thought that I had my other presentation that I borrowed it from. But there was actually a slide showing the pastor Rick Wiles, who was railing against the consumption of of plant-based burgers, and saying that actually consuming plant-based burgers is part of a Luciferian plot. And it was designed to change your DNA so that you cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Christian evangelical circles are deeply wrapped up in a lot of white nationalism, and have very little to do with Christianity. What was really interesting about his quote is that he also said that consumption of plant food is designed to make you not be human, because that would create a soulless individual. And that is how you would not be able to inherit the kingdom of God. And it's that use of, once again, human as a signifier. And you, like, he literally was saying that, like, unless you consume meat, then you are not human. And again, human, or human as a political identity, is deeply, deeply wedded to whiteness, as it was constructed literally hundreds of years before we were born. But yeah, like, with all of these examples, and I'm wrapping up here because I'm looking at my clock and I'm trying to be mindful of time. What do we do with all of this information? What do we do? Like, this is where, like, where we start to talk about solutions, or like, how veganism, or at least veganism, the way that I experience it, that I interpret it for myself, in terms of liberation for Black people and for animals, and literally collective liberation for all of us on this planet, because it's so deeply tied to, like, like the environment and the ecological crisis that we're facing. I turn to this quote. There's a lot of work that I do that is inspired by Black feminism, and this is a quote from Angela Davis, who is herself vegan. And she says, straight Black men and white women will always be the weakest links in, and thank you for including Sis Laura, in the struggle for equality, because they view equality as achieving status with white men. The problem with that is that white men's status is contingent on the oppression of other people. And I think that this is such a daring quote from Davis, because I think that it encapsulates so much of our attitudes toward other animals. We don't view equality, like we have such a warped view of equality, rather. We have such a warped view of freedom and of liberation, that we imagine liberation, or we conceive of it only through the lens of, like, having or achieving the status that white men have already had. We want to be human like these white men. We want to experience humanity the way that white people have taught us to do. And as David says, the problem with that is that white men's status is contingent on the oppression of other people. And so often we think that we can build our liberation on the backs of someone else's oppression. And that's what happens with animals all the time, because we don't even consider them to be persons. They are so, their invisibility is so complete to us in our liberation struggles. And so I can't conceive of a way that we can actually have a peace, an enduring peace or any kind, without actually recognizing that violence is real, and that we are perpetuating it every time we erase the struggles of other animals and communities of animals as minoritized persons themselves. And we see this, like, this is actually a tweet, and there are dozens, if not hundreds, of tweets like this out there. People are always dunking on veganism in one way or another. And it scores us so many, like, so many delicious cookies in online spaces. And you can see this tweet and the conversation that it ensued from it, like, if you go on Twitter. This one's from Happy She, but the concept of veganism was developed under capitalism's neocolonialism blending with orthorexia, aka the idea that food can be pure or impure. And it's designed to make people associate poverty and food poor people eat with disease in order to see them as the problem. And then, like, in a reply, like, someone else is saying, veganism is veganism is a gateway to white supremacy, and it's very concerning. Vegans are some of the most vile and anti-indigenous people I've ever seen. And this is what's, like, what's so disturbing to me, is that, like, people are saying this and they're so ignorant of, like, of the history of veganism, the actual history of capitalism. And there is this almost need to confine veganism to a way of eating or a diet, rather than a recognition that, like, our lives and our entire lifestyles, the foundation of us, like, in Western society, is built on animal exploitation. And so if we can confine veganism to a diet and tell people, oh, you're trying to tell poor people how to eat, or you're creating a disordered style of eating. If we can do that, we don't have to actually confront our bigotry toward other animals. We don't have to confront our speciesism. We don't have to confront our biophobia. We don't have to confront, like, all of these other things and all of these other anxieties and fears that are wrapped up in our treatment of all of the other people with whom we share the natural world, who are not human. And that's what we end up doing repeatedly. And yeah, like, the idea that veganism is a gateway to white supremacy, without recognizing that like it's actually the consumption of animals that white supremacists and white nationalists are actually utilizing and instrumentalizing in order to rally their people together is a complete absurdity. It is a fiction that has been built in our minds in order to avoid having to confront our own bigotry and the ways that we are so horrifically discriminatory to other animal persons. And the reality is that like vegan food or plant-based food has always been associated with poverty, or with like it's always been meat that has been considered a luxury item. And it's this deliberate and intentional rewriting of history that we engage in over and over again. And it's so heartbreaking and it's so disappointing. And these are the people that really, really need veganism the most and actively reject it in order to protect our bigotries. And it's hurtful. But there is a way back. And there is a history of this as well. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the MOVE organization, but the Philadelphia MOVE organization was a Black liberation group who strongly believed in animal liberation as well. They existed in the 1970s and 1980s. They're still there. But it was 1985 when the MOVE bombing occurred. The city of Philadelphia actually dropped a bomb on the MOVE house on Osage Avenue and killed 11 people, including, I believe, 5 or 6 children. And I believe it was 6 children and 5 adults, and countless companion animals that they had taken in who were experiencing houselessness, and literally burned Black people alive for the crime of actually reclaiming our power. And this is what was so scary about the MOVE organization to the institutions of white supremacy. They recognized that Black liberation and animal liberation didn't have to occur separate from one another. And so you see this quote here from Janine Africa. This was this was actually for The Guardian, I believe in 2018. She said, "We demonstrated against puppy mills, zoos, circuses, any form of enslavement of animals. We demonstrated against 3 Mile Island and industrial pollution. We demonstrated against police brutality, and we did so uncompromisingly. Slavery never ended. It was just disguised." And and that's so powerful to me, because again, when people try to reduce veganism as a style of eating or as like a dietary choice, they're trying so desperately to make veganism small, when really the liberation of other animals encompasses like companion animals who are trapped in puppy mills, animals who are confined to zoos, which is a relic of colonialism itself. And a large part of the prison industrial complex is executed against animals. Circuses, any form of enslavement of other animals. And then there's also this quote from that same article. "Then there were the dogs. When the 1978 siege happened, there were 12 adults and 11 children in the MOVE house. The 1978 siege being separate from the 1985 bombing. And 48 dogs. Most of the animals were strays taken in by the group as part of its philosophy of caring for the vulnerable." Notice that it says that it was a philosophy of caring for the vulnerable and not vulnerable humans themselves. Vulnerable communities can extend and do extend to other animals as well. Black liberation, animal liberation, the two are as one with MOVE. John Africa was known as the dog man, as he was rarely seen without one. And just as we wrap up, just looking again at that tweet, talking about how anti-Indigenous veganism is, when the reality is that it's the consumption of meat products. If you live in the global West, you're consuming animal products, you're doing so much harm to Indigenous communities, because the amount of deforestation that occurs in order to farm, people say often, oh, it's for farming soy so the vegans can eat it. Vegans, I have to tell you, are only 3% of the population, if that. It is not soy consumption for vegans that is driving global deforestation, and especially in the rainforests in South America. It is soy that is being farmed to feed farm animals, and it is for deforestation for livestock farming itself. And it's an under-discussed part of the climate crisis, because we don't want to actually, as I said before, confront our own participation. As long as we focus the discussion around fossil fuels and energy use, we don't have to actually examine our own individual consumption habits and how they contribute to the climate crisis, Indigenous communities, or harm to Indigenous communities, and anti-Blackness around the globe. And this is just from a few weeks ago. This was the BBC was reporting that COP26, a document leak reveals nations lobbying to change key climate report. Brazil and Argentina, two of the biggest producers of beef products and animal feed crops, again, soy, argue strongly against evidence in the draft report that reducing meat consumption is necessary to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And thank you for that. It's about 70% of of these animal feed crops that are that are for animals. It's not for human consumption. The draft report states, plant-based diets can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50% compared to the average emission-intensive Western diet. Plant-based diets can reduce, I'm just going to say this again, can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50%. I don't know how in the entire hell any of us can have a conversation about promoting enduring peace without making sure that that peace starts on our plates. We can't stop 100 companies from polluting the planet. We can't necessarily all drive hybrids tomorrow or have access to public transportation. What we do have control over is our relationships with other animals. Most of us who are high earners living in Western society have access to plant-based foods. We may not be able to eliminate our consumption of other animals entirely, or the exploitation of other animals entirely, but we can minimize that as best we can. That's something that we have control of multiple times a day. And that is one of the main ways that we can that we can promote enduring peace. And so when I say that the revolution will be plant-based, this is what I mean. It has to be plant-based because there literally is no other way forward. And to not recognize that or to intentionally ignore that is only going to further fuel the ecological crisis that we're facing and inequality with one another as humans, because humans and other animals, we're all in this together. And that brings me to my very last slide, solidarity. It's not a matter of altruism. Solidarity comes from the inability to tolerate the affront to our own integrity of passive or active collaboration in the oppression of others. And from the deep recognition that, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on this planet. And I always like to end my presentations with this because it's such a powerful quote that talks about the meaning of and the importance of solidarity. Like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on the planet. Not every other person, every other being. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening for as long as you did. All right, I have stopped the share. There we go. Go for it, Stanley, please.
Thank you so much for that excellent and insightful talk. And I would point out that just this year, PEP endorsed the Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth that has a lot in common with the things you've been talking about. Now, before we turn to the Q&A, a few more words about promoting enduring peace. And I'm going to screen share. And go back to the PowerPoint. Not yet. Try it again. Okay. We saw this one. So some things about promoting enduring peace. And this is our website. And as you see on the bottom, you get to it by pepeace.org. And I mentioned these sponsors, but on our website, we also have links to the 7 co-sponsors' sites and their Facebook pages and Twitter and so on. And I would encourage you to explore these groups, see what they're all about and see what they have to say. A little further down on the homepage, we have a section about PEP membership. And for $20 a year, you become a PEP member and you can help us out financially and then join in the the work that we do, the various campaigns, and become part of the mailing list that we have. And if you're interested in that, you can contact us at office@pepeace.org. That's right over there. And I mentioned campaigns, and we're involved. Well, we have a bold new program to avoid climate collapse. Very radical in some of its ideas. And then a small part of it is this idea of banning small gas engines, things that are on leaf blowers and lawn mowers. California actually did get rid of it this year. And we're talking about that as a national campaign. So that's some of the things we do. As James mentioned earlier, our biggest program is the Gandhi Peace Award. That's what we're most known for. And on the homepage, you see the black arrow pointing to the tab that gets you to the page. And when you click on that, you get to the basic page about the Gandhi Peace Award. You'll see these two people who were our recipients just about a year ago. White Helmet Maysoon al-Masri from Syria, and Dr. Zahar Salul, another Syrian. In the past, we've had Jackson Brown, Omar Barghouti, Ralph Nader, Cesar Chavez, and many others, going back to 1960. And I'll close that. And hopefully Christian has had a chance for a glass of water or some refreshment. And now we're going to, before we go back to the Q&A, I want to mention an honorarium goes with the Shafer Lecture, and Christopher Sebastian has generously donated his honorarium, dividing it up and donating it to Hoppy Acre and the Caring Vegan Community, London. And before we do the questions, just want to mention you can put a question in the chat. And if you're calling in, you hit *9, and that'll let us know you want to make a question. If you're on the computer, if you don't want to use the chat, you can use the reactions down on the bottom right section. And if one of those reactions you can use as a hand that raises, and hopefully we'll get to you that way. And Christian will call on you. And back to you, Christian.
Hey, just was unmuting myself. Thank you so much again, Stanley, for that. I was checking out the chat in the meantime while Stanley was giving us more backstory, and I want to address a couple of the things that had come up. First of all, thank you again to everybody who was posting your thoughts and comments and suggestions and recommendations in the chat. That is so important to me, and I always learn a lot from other people when you do that as well. And this is part of the reason why I like having the chat open during talks, so that it feels collaborative. People are talking to one another and being able to work through things in real time with one another. And that's, I'm really grateful for that. Let's see, talking about exceptionalism. Again, the talk about being rabid, species-based language is everywhere. And I'm scrolling down, I've got a couple of new messages that are closer to the end. This is important from Isa. Leshko agreed, let's also recognize how many white vegans and animal rights organizations promoting plant-based Thanksgiving dishes without denouncing the holiday itself, and how it whitewashes history. That's actually really important, and we shouldn't minimize that or pretend that that's not happening. It is an imperfect movement, as all movements for liberation always have been. How many times have Black and brown people been excluded from the queer struggle? How many times have gay men excluded lesbians and and non-binary people from the queer struggle? like how many times have imperfect things happened in other movements, the homophobia that's rampant or that had been rampant in the civil rights movement, and the exclusion of queer, Black, and brown people, and the separation of identities. This is present in the vegan movement too, and in the animal liberation movement. And I actually wrote about some of the ways in which racism is pervasive in the animal liberation movement in the essay that Stanley referenced at the beginning of my talk, for the book edited by Harold Adams on effective altruism. And my chapter is the anti-racist and anti-racism and the effective altruist. And so I address a lot of that in there too. And so I do think that it's really important that we actually address that and we recognize that that is a very real thing. The perpetuation of anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous sentiment in the movement. And we have to work just as hard to make sure that that is not the primary narrative that is being, oh, Lisa's here. She's still here. Thank you for still being here. That narrative, we have to make sure that that narrative is minimized and reduced as much as possible. And we have to make space for the people who are talking very importantly about collective liberation and the necessity of it. Let me see, I'm just reading through here again. Ideological right-wing masculine pushback against veganism because they perceive it as a threat to their identity. This is from Christoph, by the way. Their cultural traditions and privileges rooted in group-based dominance. Absolutely, absolutely. Dr. Priya is here. Insight into why some factions of white supremacist groups, like some KKK groups, espouse plant-based eating because it is pure. We also see this amongst some vegan racism. Some vegans, racism is alive and well in the vegan movement. That is, again, a really important observation. I don't know if Dr. Priya is still with us, but the perversion of what should be a liberation movement happens in a plurality of ways. As we said, you've got people who want to keep veganism as a sort of diet so that we can ignore the ways in which we perpetuate oppression against other animals. Likewise, you also have people who do use veganism as a diet that is rooted in pureness. And I think that it's not just limited to white nationalists and actual literal Nazis, but you see this this blending of veganism with the wellness community and pseudoscience communities, and and you see this this worship of raw diets or the popularizing of certain types of vegan diets. Oh, it must be whole foods and plant-based or else it's not really vegan or whatever have you. And again, this makes veganism very, very small. And I do not subscribe to all of the quote health claims that are made about vegan diets. Yes, a vegan diet can be very healthy, but a vegan diet can also consist almost exclusively of donuts and French fries. There is no one way to be vegan. And so all it means is that you are reducing, all that you will do at the end of the day is reduce your participation in animal exploitation. Ooh, Jamie Woodhouse is here. I love you people. Everybody is amazing. Jamie just said something that I think is really smart. Purity thinking sometimes also links to caste systems. Everybody is fantastic. I don't even know what to do with all of these amazing comments. This is one of the this is very, very healing for me, because this is one of the most engaged conversations that I've been able to have for a while in lockdown. And I'm so grateful for that. Please endorse the plantbasedtreaty.com. This is from Celia. I actually have endorsed the plant-based treaty myself. So me and my organization have both endorsed the plant-based treaty. I think that is, I think that the SAVE movement who put that together are doing really, really great work. Michael McNeely is asking, have you seen shifts during your course at Columbia from the students? And I absolutely have. It's really, really difficult to do, because just like with any type of conditioning, whether we're talking about anti-racism or queer theory or anything, it never happens all at once. And I think there is this desire for especially for people who are part of the animal liberation community, to see people be oh gosh, golly gee, I'm going to go vegan tomorrow. And that so rarely happens. And over relying on on conversions, I think, can actually contribute to a lot of burnout, because we don't see such immediate results as we would like to. But focusing on the systems and and pulling back that curtain so that people can see what are the mechanisms systems and what is the capitalist machinery that have contributed to the reason why we think the way that we do about food, about clothes, about entertainment, and about our exploitation of other animals really is rooted in a lot of oppressive systems and ideologies that oppress us as well, i.e. white supremacy, then that connection gets through to people a lot faster, oftentimes. Like, not always though, but recognizing that that so much of animal exploitation is wrapped up in in land grabs against Native Americans, against genocide against Native peoples and indigenous peoples, and like all of these things. It's so helpful. It's so helpful. And yeah, Stanley is recommending that people include names, books, and links in the chat. And yeah, and definitely save the chat at the end. Debbie is also here. Like, this is again, like, I am so absolutely filled up by all of the people who are participating in this today. Isa is asking, will I publish my thesis? I was going to actually put my thesis up on academia, but I didn't because I think that it's going to become a book, crossing my fingers. I don't know right now. Very early discussions about that, but there's a lot that I actually left out of my thesis that I wanted to include, going over like all of the things that have been occurring in social media spaces in the 21st century, as well as in political spaces, talking about everything that it happens on television, like media, that really the talk about the many ways that that animal exploitation is integrated into into our culture, and undermines our struggles when we ignore it. That I could probably add another 30,000 words to it before it's ready, but I end up doing things like this, which are much more immediately gratifying for me because I love to engage with other people. Annie Eliza is asking, how can we get a hold of this session's recording? I'm pretty sure that Stanley will be able to answer that question. Everyone is, I'm certain, on the list of participants that have signed up for it, and there will probably be something on the Facebook event for this as well. I think that there are mostly comments, but not so many questions here, so I'm just skipping around trying to see if there's anything that I missed. Pratik, agree, Jamie, that was the same problem with Indian vegetarianism as well. Ooh, boy, I went to a couple of, if you're not on Clubhouse and you have access to it, definitely download Clubhouse. I went to a couple of awesome Clubhouse events where people were talking about Indian vegetarianism and casteism, and all of these things were enormously eye-opening for me. Mine is a very Western perspective, and like I said, it's mostly centered in US American culture, although European culture is included as well at different points. Dr. Priya says, can you take my class at Columbia? No, actually, because I have experienced such terrible burnout that I am no longer teaching at Columbia. I stopped this year. And I am a tired Sebastian. I am a very tired Sebastian, and I haven't really talked very publicly about that. But yeah, I actually had to stop. As much as I love doing it, it was something that that I couldn't continue the traveling back and forth. I also could not reconcile going back to the States twice a year, and racking up the air miles, wanting to minimize my personal climate footprint. Along with the politics of teaching at an Ivy League university, there are just a lot of reasons why I just couldn't do this another semester. But I'm still here, obviously, and I'm still doing things like this. And I think that the accessibility of having online events is really important, because even when the pandemic is over, people with disabilities and people who have limited economic access are not going to be able to travel everywhere. Those people are still going to be here. We are all still going to be here. And I think that having online events and making sure that these things continue to happen after we all return to our normal, whatever that may look like, is really, really, really important. And I hope other people see the importance of that as well. And we don't we don't just abandon it because we can all get back to our spaces and and hug each other in person. Although I want to do that too. I definitely plan to do that as often as I can. Let's see, Laura's sending books. Afro Dog is actually on my website. It's one of the, it is an absolutely excellent book. Thank you for that recommendation, Laura. The Oxen at the Intersection, Beyond Beef. Thank you, Rachel. Roger is here. He says, from John Talent, what do you think is the best way to bridge the gap between the non-vegan left and the vegan left? I was hoping that John would be able to answer that question for me. Maybe we'll put our heads together and we'll talk about that later, because that is really, really huge. It's really, really difficult. And I think John is doing really, really important work on social media in particular. And I'm really, really grateful for it. If you're not following the Veganarchist meme page on Facebook and on Twitter, you should. And it is a portmanteau of the word vegan and anarchist. So it's the Veganarchist meme page. If you look for that, you'll probably be able to find it. Laura says I better include her in that conversation, and you better believe that I will. Oh, thank you. Super, super emoji faces. And I think that's it. I'm so grateful to everybody who is sending all of all of this love. And you've really made my night. It's 8:30. I should be exhausted. I am exhausted, but I'm also full of a lot of energy right now. That comes from all of you who are participating and who stuck with me for an hour and a half. And I can't believe that. And I don't know what to say. It has been a really tough year. And I am enormously emotionally exhausted, as I'm sure are a lot of you. But being able to do things like this, they really make me feel good. And you all make me feel good. I know I've said it before, but I appreciate you all so much. And I feel enormously blessed. And I am really grateful to Pep for having me, and for being able to take part in the Shafer Lecture this year. So Stanley, do you have anything to wrap up with?
Well, thank you for that great presentation and Q&A. So rapid fire, taking care of all these questions and comments. Again, people can save the chat. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, those three little dots. A lot of people have never done it. You click on the three little dots, and one of the choices is save chat. And then once you do it, you can find out where you've saved it to. It actually lets you know that, and that's important. And then someone asked, is this being recorded? It absolutely has been recorded, and we will get that up in YouTube and Facebook and so on within the week. So check back at our website, and I'll put it in the chat one last time, peace.org. And that's our main link to get to our materials. And please check us out. A lot of other things that we get involved with. Any last words, Christian?
None from me, just thank you all again.
All right, so we're going to end now, and James is waving, and let's all wave. And have a great day or night, depending where you are. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.